So here comes Rawls' account of community. It is called the sentimental conception of community. In this particular conception of community, participants have certain shared final ends. Scheme of cooperation is considered as a good in itself, and individual interests are complementary and overlapping. The criticism of Sandel against this particular conception or account of community is that it doesn't meet what Rawls' theory require, which is to redeem the notion of common assets involved in the difference principle, or specifically a notion of community capable of laying legitimate claim to the assets necessary to its purposes without using some as means to other ends and without collapsing into a radically situated subject. In addition, what the Rawlsian theory needs is a conception of a community that could penetrate the self more profoundly than even the sentimental view permit. Hence, Michael J. Sandel presented his own conception of community, which is dubbed as the Sandel's strong view or the constitutive conception of community. In this particular notion, in that community, individuals conceive their identity as defined to some extent of the community of which they are a part, meaning the community contributes in a partial manner to the identity of the individuals belonging to that particular community. Second, they are concerned with what they are and not just what they have. They're not obsessed with attributes. And third, attachment they discover is constituent of their identity. So the attachment they have with that community and with the other selves present in that community plays a large role in making up their own identity. It is important to remember that the intersubjective theory or description of the subject presented by Rawls, as what I have mentioned earlier, cannot be accounted for by a conception that is individualistic such as Rawls, because the terms differ in function. It's all about reciprocity versus sharing. And it does not account for a conception that is individualistic, since one's identity is highly connected to one's situation or to one's being situated in a particular community, compared to Rawls, which is very individualistic. And please remember, since Rawls' conception or Rawls' theory in general is based on a deontological assumption, the subject isn't allowed to constitute its own identity. Hence, there is a problem, since as what we have mentioned earlier, a conception of community should penetrate the self more profoundly than even the sentimental view permits, and deontological assumptions such as that of Rawls doesn't allow that particular requirement. So, the response of Rawls is that there is this faculty of reflection that allows such individual in his own model of community to be penetrated by the profound sentimental view. Um, but Sandel responded that will alone isn't enough, and that Rawls should prove to us that this faculty of reflection present in his conception of community has the capacity for self-knowledge, and the agency is involved in the cognitive sense. Hence, our next examination, or what we need to examine next, involves this agency of reflection, this agency of the individual, his capacity of knowing himself. But before proceeding, let us elaborate more on this capacity for reflection. The capacity for reflection is that Rawls' subject of possession requires such thing. So the question on community leads on the question of reflection. Because we need to examine Rawls' theory of agency first before understanding the role of reflection in the grand scheme of Rawls. So, specifically, the theory of agency is how the self arrives at its ends by choosing those ends and selves as willing subject to objects of choice, and choice agency in the voluntarist sense. So here are the fundamental question. What exactly goes when there is this process of choosing? And what does reflection play? Or what is the role of this particular human capacity of reflecting in arriving at such choices? So here comes the account of agency and ends that are under the conception of the good in order to answer those questions related to choice. But before we proceed, there is a need to compare and contrast the conception of the right and the conception of the good. The conception of the right is a product of collective choice in the original position. It is the actual persons who not have a hand in it due to being hypothetical. Limits conception of the good people may pursue. So these conceptions of the right and good are related to the agency and role of reflection in a particular community. So let's proceed with the good. Products of individual choices in the real world, and individuals are free to choose and adopt subjective perception of the good. Here comes the criticism of Sandel against this conception in relation to agency and reflection. Actual persons do not have a hand on it due to being hypothetical. This refers to the conception of the right. And justice apply whether we like it or not, and is not a subject of our agency in this particular conception. As we have mentioned earlier, this conception of the right limits conception of the good people may pursue because he is, or that conception is prior to our conception of the good. So in other words, choice is done in an antecedently established right, i.e. the principle of justice. Here comes the entire criticism of J. Sandel to such account of agency and reflection. According to Michael J. Sandel, such account does not introduce a self-reflection we're concerned with. Here's the Rawlsian response. Individual is compelled to choose since no determinant as to what is the best choice. Hence, self-reflection enters to determine the best we can through the things we want and how we want them. But here's an analysis of how problematic such conception of agency and reflection is. There is a reflection in the Rawlsian conception, but in a limited scope only. In the criteria of Charles Taylor, Rawlsian individuals will only get a simple Weyer type of reflectors since a strong reflection is impossible in Rawls' theory. So this simple Weyer type of reflectors is that individuals reflecting in a very shallow manner. So now, the result is that theory of the good does not allow for the notion of the agency in the cognitive sense present in the conception of community that is consecutive. Unfortunately, this implies that such renders Rawls' limited accounts of agency and reflection as implausible, incapable of making sense about choice and the determinants of choice. And here's the review of what we have gone so far in discussing all those conceptions involving Rawls' moral theory. Specific and in-depth examination of Rawls' concept of the good and all that consists under it, i.e., difference principle, agency, choice, community, etc., as a means of justifying the spilled over of the self from the concept of the right to the concept of the good, and as means of salvaging a failed conception of community for the establishing of subject of possession, did not yield plausibility and consistency as the qualification for Rawls' moral theory as a whole in order for it to be used in properly assessing Rawls' theory of the subject. In other words, Rawls' moral theory is incoherent, inconsistent, and implausible.